All right, I think there might be a break listed now, but we're going to skip that because we want to get back on schedule, but of course, feel free to move around if you need to. If you want to continue the conversation with Julia on telehealth, we welcome you to do so. She will be in the Kirby Auditorium, and you guys can continue that conversation. I have one housekeeping thing. I forgot I'm not using that mic. I have a credit card from Deirdre Demoro. So if you are that person, I will put the credit card over here. I don't want you to leave without it. So our next panel is we're going to talk about the American electorate. And my great colleague, the person that John Oliver called the most patient man on television, and the only BPC staff member who has his own Wikipedia page, and one of the most hilarious people and wonderful people I've ever worked with, I'd like to introduce you and call on the stage Steve Scully, our head of communications. Thank you, Steve.
Kelly, thank you. How y'all doing? So we have Spokane, Washington, we've got Georgia, we've got Oregon. Thank you all for coming around the country. I want to welcome two excellent talkers. Tara Setmayer, who should be on The View. We think she should be on The View with the Lincoln Project and with the University of Virginia. Tara, come on up. Thank you. And the great Dr. Eddie Glaude from Princeton University, MSNBC contributor. Thanks for crossing the river from Princeton to come to Philadelphia.
Absolutely.
Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much.
If I were on The View, Steve, I wouldn't be able to come and do things like
There
this.
you go. We're so glad you're with us.
That's all right.
Thank
Not all
you.
money is good money.
So I want to begin by talking about the electorate, but I want to begin with how do you get them engaged? These people are engaged, they're interested, they care about the country, but we're not getting enough people to the votes, to the polls. They're not voting, they're not participating. How do we change that?
Well, I think it's really important to understand something, that the people who are in this room are the type of people who are the change makers. You guys are the stakeholders. And that should be everyone. This place should be filled out, standing room only, because every American needs to understand that they are the stakeholders in this great country of ours. The founding fathers, and you see the quotes of them all over here, really invested in, and we're hoping that the American people would understand their role. Mm-hmm. There's a certain responsibility in being an American. There's a responsibility when you have a democracy, when you have a representative democracy. We're not a pure democracy. They saw the wisdom in not doing that. We saw what happened when it was just a pure democracy. There's checks and balances, there's guidelines, guardrails. But it all ultimately comes back to we the people. And the responsibility lies with every single American of voting age to go out there and participate. And I think what's happened is there was a certain level of apathy for so long. It's kind of like when you get married, they say, oh, you're fat and happy, you're gonna gain a couple pounds. Oh, well, you're good, fat and happy now. Americans were fat and happy for a long time. And until they realized, oh my goodness, what is going on? And there's a couple inflection points throughout history where it shakes the American electorate awake. But this time it feels a little bit different, I think. Something that we haven't really seen in quite some time. And I just think that when people feel as though their own interests are at stake, and they start to notice that their way of life may be threatened, however that's defined, then all of a sudden it becomes, uh-oh, maybe I need to do something.
Yeah.
And there has been a lot going on in the Trump era that I have been horrified by and continue to be. But one of the good things is that I think it woke a lot of Americans up on both good and bad sides. But it woke people up and they said, okay, this is not how I want my country to be. This is not who I want my kids to grow up and emulate. I need to do something. And the more that people start to do something, I think the more they see a permission structure that maybe I should get involved too. Or, well, wait a minute, I can actually make a difference. And I just think that that's what needs to happen. We need to remind people that it is our responsibility. We get the government we deserve. If you sit out, you don't have the right to complain. But if you get involved, then you at least made an effort to try to do what this entire constitutional republic that we have was intended to do, which was to represent we the people. So get involved, participate.
But Eddie, as we sit in the shadow of Independence Hall and we feel the history of this city and what it represents, is this what the founders anticipated?
Well, Madison definitely understood what would happen if we didn't have virtuous citizens. The founders were particularly concerned if there were outsized interests who would disturb the balance of power. The checks and balances are a reflection of their worry about certain actors or elements distorting and disfiguring our democracy. So they understood that, Edmund Burke and the like, and those folks like him, who were concerned about mob rule, that democracy put an unjustified faith in the capacity of everyday ordinary folk to engage in their own decision-making, to rule their own lives.
Right.
They worried about the passions overrunning the process. And so there were these concerns. We had to have a public engaged in reasoned deliberation about their circumstances of living if they were going to engage in self-governing, right? But, so I think they anticipated, just as those who were always skeptical of democracy anticipated a moment like this, like our own. But, as you talk about, those folks who are disaffected, how do we get them mobilized and excited? We have to organize, and we have examples, right? I'm thinking about sharecroppers in the Delta of Mississippi who were beaten down by an economic process, who didn't think they had any opening. What happened when 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds went among them and began to give them the tools to create the conditions under which they would see themselves as actors that could actually change the South? What do we do with coal miners in West Virginia or workers in Appalachia who, when they organized, saw that they had the power? And I think this is really important for us to see, that those of us who are worried about our democracy, we need to get about that hard work of organizing everyday ordinary people so that we can understand that the power is in our hands, not in these interests, these special interest groups who seem to be distorting and disfiguring our democracy as it is now.
So if I could, I want to frame this in two different tranches. I want to talk about the problems that we're facing today and then talk about some solutions. And as I look at the problems, Tara, one of the issues is you have congressional districts that are gerrymandered in such a way that there's no incentive for a member of Congress to cross the aisle, and that also disillusions the voters. And you have an enormous amount of money. We were talking earlier about the ads here in Pennsylvania, one attack ad after another, that further disillusions the voters. So address those two issues, money and redistricting.
Not so many from Mastriano. He's a little broke there, $400,000. It's not a lot. No, but you're right. There's a couple of factors, and something else here in Pennsylvania is closed primaries. That's something else that I think is part of the conversation that we need to have about some electoral reforms to get more people involved. Because if you are like me, like Michael too, I think, or as independents now, I'm no longer a Republican. I left the party after Trump decided that he wasn't going to accept the results of the election, and I said, that's it. I've had it after 27 years. But where I live in Virginia, you can vote in a primary. Here in Pennsylvania, you can't. So you are disenfranchised if you are not part of a partisan tribe. That is something, along with the power of incumbency, gerrymandering. We see all of these cases. Right now is a case in front of the Supreme Court with Alabama, with the way these state legislatures and some commissions are drawing the lines. It's rigging the system a little bit in favor of incumbency. And so that also is something that makes people think, well, if I live in a district that's so partisan, my vote doesn't count, why bother? We just can't allow that, because not every single election is an election that is federal. You have local elections, you have school board elections. Not all elections are partisan. And you have, down ballot elections matter. All of these things matter. So when you see these things and people say, yeah, but then my vote doesn't matter. In the state of Virginia, where I live now, I'm from Jersey though, I'm from over the bridge. Where I live now, when you're a Jersey girl, you're always a Jersey girl, right? People say, where do you live? I'm like, where are you from, or where do I live? I'm from Jersey, I live in Virginia.
What exit? I'm just kidding.
Oh, for God's sakes. It's actually 163 off the Parkway.
There you go.
Paramus, shout out to Bergen County. Anyway, but in Virginia, not too long ago, there was a state delegate race that was decided by one vote. Another one, it was tied, they flipped a coin. So just think, if you were that person in that district that said, my vote doesn't matter. It does. So you have to continue to make people understand and give examples. It matters. And so I just think that there are different levels of it. At a federal level, I think there should still be conversations about reforming gerrymandering and open primaries and those things like that. But that's a state-by-state issue, because our voting system isn't centralized. But I just think that as we're working toward that, this is an imperfect union. That's one of the imperfections that I think we need to continue to work on.
But on the issue of money, so campaign finance
money
laws worked for a while on the federal level until a series of Supreme Court decisions, and basically the floodgates are open in terms of money in politics. If you could address that issue and how that relates to the electorate saying, again, does my vote count? I don't have the money, I can't contribute, I'm not going to participate.
Right, we know that Citizens United changed the landscape in every way imaginable. And wherever you sit on the ideological spectrum, I think that's a fact we can agree upon, right? That it's changed not only how elections are run or campaigns are run, it changes who can actually run. So part of the problem is that we have, in some ways, a kind of, how can I put it? We have a deficit in quality human beings running for office.
That's an understatement of the year. Yes.
And that deficit has something to do with not wanting to reveal one's private life in trying to run for public office. And it also has to do with, I don't have the money to run. Look at some of the governor's races and the amount of money that's being spent. It's obscene in a way. And you have to ask yourself, how does this distort and disfigure our democracy? Where is this money coming from? Right? Not just simply from donors like you and me, but the dark money that Sheldon Whitehouse and others are trying to talk about. Where is that coming from? Look at all the money that the man who, I know I'm being partisan here, and we shouldn't be, but the man who led the Federalist Society, how much money is he sitting on right now? And what will...
With the endowment, $1.5
billion. And how will that impact, right, our political system? It is...
Leonard Leo.
Yeah, it is distorting and disfiguring it. So I think that's important. And then I think the money that's been deployed for the attack ads activates our passions. It activates our grievances, our fears, and our hatreds. And, we've been talking about fear in politics since Machiavelli.
Right.
Right? And so those attack ads are aimed to make you feel as if your way of life is under assault. And at that moment, once we are motivated by fear and grievance, we're not engaged in the deliberative process that democracy requires, if that makes sense.
And
can I just add to that really quickly? I think that, and obviously full disclosure, that I, as a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, we benefit from the campaign finance laws that allow people to donate to us so that we can be the tip of the spear in these campaigns. But there's, I think that there should be a certain amount of transparency after a certain amount of contribution, and there's areas where that should be reformed, and I get that. But I also think that money necessarily doesn't have the same influence that it once did. And the Trump campaign in 2016 proved that, because Hillary Clinton had way more money than Donald Trump did as far as campaign money, by a lot. But he got free media. We had Jeff Zucker and Phil Griffin up here before, and I used to be with CNN for 6 years, and I would challenge that Jeff Zucker had a lot to do with how Donald Trump got, the legitimacy all the way back to his days as, as a reality show host on the Apprentice. He greenlit that, and then giving all that free media to Trump during 2016 contributed to it. And I think he admitted that he wouldn't do that again, so I was glad to see.
Right.
But
he would agree with you.
Yeah, and it's a little late now. Hindsight is 2020. Thanks, Jeff.
He's right over there. Jeff,
is he? Thanks. But I think that because of social media now, you don't necessarily, the money that used to be that you needed before for the traditional attack ads and the traditional ways that you use money, you don't necessarily need that anymore, because there are other ways to reach people right there on their phones that doesn't require anywhere near as much money. So if you look right now at some of the candidates and who's doing well in certain areas and how much money in comparison, I mean, there was a time in politics where if someone like Josh Shapiro had, $10 million in the bank and his opponent had 400,000, you would say, there's no way his opponent has a shot in hell of winning. How's he going to possibly compete? That's not the case anymore. That race is still within striking distance. Same thing when, in other races across the country. So I would say that money is still an issue, but not like it used to be, because there's so many other ways now to reach voters directly that don't require the exorbitant amounts of money that it used to, because of social media and the access that we have on our phones.
There is another component to all of this, and I would suspect in the Princeton classroom your students bring this up, because the fabric of a democracy is the trust that the electorate has with their elected officials. We are losing that. We're losing that with the media. We're losing that with elected officials. We saw it play out this summer before the U.S. Supreme Court, a very public spat, and I would call it a spat, when you have the Chief Justice defending decisions and you have Justice Elena Kagan critical of decisions, not naming names, and then you have the statements by Justice Alito. I mean, the court was one of the last bastions of trust, and that as an institution is also fraying.
Oh, absolutely. When I say that American democracy is in crisis, I'm thinking about it at the level of institutions and at the level of our ideas of the public good. So, we have an imperial presidency that has been shown has been revealed for what it is. We've always worried about executive power being unchecked. And the question I asked over and over again is, what happens when you have someone in office without a commitment to democratic norms with this kind of power? We get Trump, we saw what happened. You got a gerrymandered House of Representatives, so it's not a representative body in any substantive way. You have a broken Senate, so it's not the best deliberative body in the world, and you have a politicized court. You have laws, you have, government passing laws that don't fit with the majority of Americans in terms of aligning policy. So there's a sense in which there's a crisis of legitimacy in the country, right? And then you layer on top of that deep cultural, right, and demographic fear and terror. Folk just don't know what to do with these racially ambiguous babies on Cheerios commercials.
Yeah.
As one of those, I'm biracial. Trust me, it's going to be all right.
Right.
I think you turn out all right.
But people, there is this general fear, and the great replacement isn't new.
Yeah.
It's the same structural discourse that we saw in 1924, 1923. And so you overlay all of that with the institutional kind of fracturing and fragmentation. It's a crisis. It's a crisis. And so we have to understand the stakes of the moment. And this is where, Steve, I understand we're in an unconvention. There are moments in the history of a nation when the choices are clear and you cannot stay in the middle. Because if you stay in the middle, a choice has been made.
Yeah.
A choice would have been made. And I can't wait for us to argue about that.
Another factor in this, in put on your political hat, is Democrats gaming the system, supporting the MAGA Republicans, hoping that that candidate will be a weaker candidate in the general election. But you have to wonder if they are playing with fire.
So I'm going to answer this from two hats. First hat, I'm going to put on as the democracy warrior, and I think that this is, you cannot try to make the case that the other side is a threat to democracy and then put money behind them as a candidate. That is really difficult to square when the whole argument is about, our democracy is in peril. We have to make sure that these people are nowhere near power and we're the good guys. And then you turn around and you fund the bad guys. Now, take that hat off, put on the campaign pure partisan hat, and you do what you got to do to get 50 plus 1. And if you think that getting the worst possible candidate as your opponent is the way to do that, the cynical part of politics is then you go and do whatever you have to do to get that person to be your candidate. Now, in this day and age, because this game has been played for a long time. A lot of people haven't realized that some of these are the games that are played even on your side. You're like, our side would never do that. Trust me, politics ain't beanbag, and they say that for a reason. But in this day and age, you have to be careful because of the point I made before. You don't necessarily have to be well-funded. You don't have to be well-educated. You don't have to be qualified to be a candidate and have a shot at winning. But if you are cunning, if you appeal to the constituency, you say what people want to hear, you're a very good, smooth talker, none of those things matter. We're seeing this unfold right now in many races across the country, one in particular, Georgia, a Senate race.
So,
right?
let's
so
talk
you have to be careful. I think it's playing with fire.
Although he's not a smooth talker.
No, not a smooth talker. No. Even though last night I was on Comedy Central last night with Charlemagne the God. He has this Comedy Central show now called Hell of a Week. And he actually felt that Herschel Walker speaks the same language as his constituents in Georgia, that he does have an appeal. And I said, I'm not so sure about that. I would like to give the people of Georgia statewide more credit than that. But there's obviously an appeal. I have an opinion on what that is. I think it's more negative partisanship and tokenism than it is necessarily relating to Herschel Walker, but that's a whole different panel. But my point here with this is that, a whole different panel. But my point here with this is that if you do play with fire, because Herschel Walker is virtually tied with Raphael Warnock. That's all I need to say about that. So you got to be careful. You can't play with that fire because anybody can win nowadays. I mean, you have Lauren Boebert as a member of Congress.
And it's really important. I think I'm gonna put back on the democracy hat. I understand the political operative hat.
Yeah.
Every time one of these persons, one of these people, these individuals, they get a platform and they sow distrust in the very process.
Yes.
It literally erodes the foundations of our democracy, to use the wrong verb. It puts a crack in it, right? So you think you're funding a nut, and that particular candidate has the platform to call into question whether or not the voting systems is legitimate, and every time they do it, every time they say it, every time it's amplified, it deepens distrust. And it deepens the sense of illegitimacy. So it's a very, very dangerous game. It's a very cynical game. And if what's on the ballot right now is democracy and autocracy, or democracy and that which isn't, stop playing damn games.
Mm-hmm. Just look at what happened in Illinois, right? In Pete Meyer's district. That's one of the examples, right? In Pete Meyer's district, the Democrats funded his primary opponent, who was completely unqualified, an election denier, and he ends up beating Pete Meyer, and then Meyer turns around and endorses him.
Right. And see, this is a really important
And that gives the guy legitimacy now. So which is it? Either he was unqualified, he's an election denier, and he's dangerous, or he's not. But that sense of partisanship and tribalism overtakes their sense of duty to democracy. And that, to your point, when they do this, it gives it legitimacy and sows those seeds more and more and more, and you get what you have now, over 290 candidates running in this country who are election deniers.
And that was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Gerald Ford's old district.
Yeah.
You said something earlier, Eddie, I want to come back to, because we're not always looking for the middle. In that room over there, September 17th, 1787, our forefathers had fierce debate on the Constitution. And they had a lot of disagreements. But at the end of the day, they came together. We've had a successful year in Congress on bipartisanship, but if you watch media, you feel that it's been divisive and corrosive, and we're going to hell in a handbasket. So my question to you is how do we get to the point where we can encourage that debate, but also say, okay, we'll compromise. We'll get that 65% that Reagan talked about, and I'll worry about the other 30 or 40% later.
It's a complicated answer, to be honest with you. So I'm obviously what people would describe as a progressive, right? But I find myself engaged, like this morning, on a show, hosted by Joe Scarborough, or on a show hosted by Nicole Wallace, right? Former Republicans, right?
And they're always asking you about democracy.
Always asking me about democracy. And so part of what I want to say in response to your question, given the place from which I come, Steve, is who bears the brunt of the compromise? Who bore the brunt of the compromise in that room? People that made me possible. We get the 3/5 compromise. We get the compromise around slavery. We get the compromise that allowed the South, which was the economic engine that allowed the country to flourish. Who bore the brunt of the compromise? What does it mean to be in the middle on the question of slavery?
Right.
What does it mean to be in the middle on the question of democracy? What does it mean to be in the middle on Dobbs? That's a question we have to ask. I mean, we can be, but we have to ask what that means ethically and what it means morally. So part of what I think bipartisanship at its best is that when there's a kind of common agreement that you and I share that this is a problem that we need to address, we just have different ways of getting at it. Mm-hmm. But if the middle ground is fertilized by bad faith, which then leaves in place all the things that haunt this place, this country, then what the hell are we doing? Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? So you invoke Reagan 65%. Reagan? To me? Reagan is as and here for me, for
here
Reagan.
Here we go.
This is part of it. Again, I have this conversation with people with whom I disagree on some of the particulars, but with whom I share a basic concern for everyday ordinary people, with whom I think are decent. But so how do we get to the middle? We have to cultivate deep and abiding trust. And that's hard to do in a country saturated in bad faith. Does that make sense? Was I rambling?
No. It does. So I want to tell you one story. I mentioned it on the radio program with Eddie, but in December of 2008, I'm in the Oval Office doing the second to last interview with George W. Bush.
Yeah.
And I asked him the question, I said, Mr. President, what will you be thinking on January 20th, 2009, as you're on the west front of the Capitol and you see Barack Obama being sworn in as president? He looked at me, he said, I'm a Republican. I think John McCain would have been one hell of a president. And I supported him and I wanted him to be my successor. He lost. When Barack Obama is sworn in, I'm going to look at him, I'm going to watch history unfold as the first African-American president, and I'm going to cheer him on, and I'm going to be available to him to help in any way as a citizen because he will be my president. Mm-hmm. I tell you that story.
Class act all the way.
What happened?
Well, if you ask George Bush what he thought on Inauguration Day in 2017, he told us that was some
what was the line?
He said that was some weird bleep.
Yeah, we're a family audience.
Little did we know how weird it was going to get.
But what has happened?
Yeah, you know, it didn't just start then.
Exactly.
And a lot of us know that now. And I think for some of us, I know for myself, I was naive to how deeply rooted a lot of these grievances were, how far it extended beyond just economic grievance, that there was a racial component to this. It took me a long time to finally say, yeah, that it was more than just economic grievance. There was a racial component to that too, and a xenophobic part of that too, and that ugliness was hard to come to terms with. My good friend Stuart Stevens, who's a veteran of 5 presidential campaigns, he wrote and dozens and dozens of other campaigns, smart guy, an amazing writer. He wrote a book called It Was All a Lie. And it was one of the most difficult reads for me as a Republican for 27 years, a conservative, to look back and reflect on when I was in it for all the right reasons, for policy reasons, for the old school conservative principles, and realize that a lot of other people were not in it for the same reasons, and that a lot of this was all a lie. And it was difficult to come to terms with. So I say that to say that this where we are today started decades ago. It's been building up to this point. Some would argue that the Newt Gingrich era really ushered that in, where with the advent of conservative talk radio, which was very influential in my road to becoming a conservative, actually. I mean, those in Jersey, Bob Grant, and then Rush Limbaugh, and listening to the end of the 90s, being part of all of that.
So Rush influenced you?
Oh, hugely, hugely. When I was in George Washington University in 1993, there was a Rush room. Of your old school Rush listeners, there was a Rush room at Blackie's Steakhouse on M Street, which is no longer there now, where we used to go and listen to Rush Limbaugh at lunchtime. We'd take the college Republicans. I was vice chairman of the college Republicans then, and we would take our group down and go to the Rush room. So hugely, hugely influential. So I get that. I was part of that, listening, and I realized, I look back now and I go, oh my God, what? Is that how I sounded? Was it always like this? Like, I had to do a lot of personal reflection. And so how we got here, I think there are a lot of points along the way where we see this hyper-partisanship, this idea of us versus them, the idea of this person being your political enemy, all being fomented from late 80s, 90s, when you put a camera, when C-SPAN was started, putting that camera in.
It's all C-SPAN's fault.
It's all C-SPAN's fault. Call Brian Lamb, it's his fault. No, when they started putting cameras in the House chamber, and Newt Gingrich recognized this as a congressman and was like, haha, I can do these 1-minute floor speeches and I can say whatever I want and get it on camera. And he really utilized that. Now, most people didn't know that there's nobody in the chamber. It's just him. But he wasn't talking to people in the chamber. He was talking to the camera, knowing that they could use that clip and they could beam that out to whomever. And then you get talk radio would talk about it. And then you get Fox, then now you have Fox News in the 90s. And you have Roger Ailes understanding how to get people's emotions involved in things and the language they would use and how they would frame the issues, very us versus them, and getting people ginned up. And then you have the internet, and then you have social media, and the more sensational you are, the more attention you get. I call it the Jerry Springerization of politics. In 1992, when Bill Clinton was running for office, and he was asked during an MTV roundtable, do you wear boxers or briefs? I was horrified by that. People thought it was cool. I'm like, you're asking the potential next president of the United States what kind of drawers he wears? What are we doing? Why does that matter? So it all became this part of culture, kind of the debasing of our culture in a way has led to this. So there are lots of things, in my opinion, that have led to this point that didn't just start with the Trump era.
So let's talk about solutions. You are in a You give me a look, oh my goodness. But you are in a perfect laboratory because you're talking to students, Gen Z, and you're going to hear from Sophie Barron later. I tell you, she reaffirms my faith in the next generation. But my question to you is how do we move ahead? How do we get the electorate back engaged in the process? If you could wave a magic wand and provide some solutions, what would they include? And what are your students telling you?
Steve, yeah.
Is that too big of a question?
No, I'm just thinking about the younger generation. You know, so much is placed on their shoulders.
Yes.
And in some ways, you know, the Gen Zers or the Gen Yers, whichever alphabet we want to use, we might want to describe them as the catastrophic generation. They've come of age in the midst of mass murder, mass shootings, climate, a planet that is collapsed, that is screaming, a pandemic, economic collapse. We can go on and on and on, right? So they know that our world is broken. But at the same time, some of them are reaching for new languages. I see it in my classroom. They're reaching for different ways of thinking about the world, and others are reaching for old languages. Dylann Roof wasn't a baby boomer. When we look at the Proud Boys, they're not made up of baby boomers.
Yeah.
So it's happening just in Europe as folk are looking at the world as it is doesn't work. Do we reach for different understandings of government? Maybe we need to think about a different economic system that doesn't begin with the assumption that people are disposable. So you have folk who are thinking about green economies then you have folk who are reaching for old languages of authoritarianism, old languages of racism, old languages of Nazism, right? Of fascism and the like, right? And we see them mobilizing and organizing in Europe. We see them mobilizing and organizing at home. And so what I see among young folk, they're grappling for answers. And it has everything to do with this is the beginning of a solution, changing the nature of our political system whereby we begin to deliver policies that affect the actual life circumstances of everyday ordinary people, where folk can see in real time that the system isn't rigged for the top 1%. But if you work 40 hours a week, that you should be able to make a living wage, keep a roof over your head, send your kids to college, and allow them to dream big dreams. It doesn't seem to work that way anymore. And so they're trying to figure out how to reach for policy solutions that can speak to that reality. I don't have an answer, obviously. The only thing I could do is offer descriptions to clear the space so that they can do the imaginative work that I seemingly can't do.
What about you? How do we get there? How can we make this a more perfect union? What would your solutions be to the problems that we've outlined here today?
Well, I would say that our economic system, capitalism still works. It's still the greatest economic system in the world, and it has brought more people out of poverty into prosperity than any other system. But there needs to be, I forget who said it, but they called it like compassionate capitalism. I think it was Scott Galloway, actually. I just interviewed him and read his book, and I know Michael did too. I think he's referred to him a couple times during here. It's a fantastic book. It's called Adrift. It's amazing because the charts are very easily digestible. But he talks about this. Now, he's a capitalist guy, but he also talks about the necessity to have certain aspects of capitalism reimagined so that it does work for more people, and I think that's fair. But I think it also, we need to find what unites us. Regardless of whether you're black, white, red, yellow, green, male, female, transgender, whatever, there are certain fundamental human emotions, characteristics, desires, wants that are all the same. Everyone wants to be able to provide for their families. They want to have the pursuit of happiness is what most Americans want. They want equal access to the pursuit of happiness. And when you start to find what binds us and you start to try to step out of your silo, we've been so siloed, and that discourages me when I see people that don't associate with folks that are different than them or don't have the opportunity to to interact with folks that are different than them, or that discourages me, because where I'm from, it's very heterogeneous. You know, New York, New Jersey, Philly, the Northeast, it's a very heterogeneous area. You're exposed to all kinds of different peoples at all kinds of different income levels. And it's like, you get a sense of what this is, you know, these are things that you can unite over sports. I'm a Giants fan. I don't care if I'm in Philly. I wear it proudly. I wear it proudly. That's all right.
I'm with you. We still love you.
That's okay. That's part of being a fan. But no, but it's like music, sports. You know, there are things, love of certain foods, like there are things that are not political, that have nothing to do with politics, that bind us. It could be the love of, you know, bird watching and, you know, who knows, collecting coins, whatever it is, right? You find those things and you start from there. We have to start finding areas of common ground that are not politics, or else we're never going to get past it, because we're so much more alike than we are different.
Tara, that's so important. It's so key. It's such an important point, but what I've been grappling with, and I know we only have a little bit of time here, is the intimacy of our hatreds. Mm-hmm. How intimate our hatred is, right?
And intense.
People knew who tied the fan around Emmett Till's neck and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. They knew. What I mean by that, they knew, because they drank beer with him. They played chess with him, or checkers, right? People know who stormed the Capitol. People know what folk are saying around your dinner tables. You know what, we're not gonna talk about that today. Leave that out. You know what you're hearing. And then we're so separate that we're walking mysteries to each other. And so in those intimate spaces, hatred festers, so that the stereotype stands in for me. So what we have to do, what I have to do, it seems to me, in this moment, is bring my full self into this room, no matter what you think about me. To bring the fullness of who I am, to not leave the particularity of who I am at the door as a precondition for me to have a conversation with you, but to bring the fullness of who I am. And that becomes the basis for creating genuine relationship and mutuality, it seems to me. But we have to deal with the intimate spaces where all of this stuff festers.
Because the divisions are so real.
Right, and show empathy. Because I think it's hard, especially now, to your point, how the intimacy and intensity of that dislike for the other side, I get it. But it's like, okay, now there are always going to be people where it's just not possible, right? Which is unfortunate, but that's just the reality of it. But most people, if you show some some empathy, you know, I understand what you're saying. I just disagree, and this is why.
Exactly.
That is so much more difficult, it seems, today, because we're so disconnected because of social media. I'm going to keep going back to that, because you can look, there have been democracy surveys and different studies done on how social media has impacted democracy around the world, starting in 2011, roughly, where more and more people had access to Twitter or Facebook and, you know, cell phones, where democracy has been under assault all over the world, from Brazil to Hungary to here, because we can hide behind the anonymity of our phones and arguing with people where you're no longer now face-to-face with someone. It's a whole different ballgame when you're arguing face-to-face. Trust me, I've been to Eagles-Giants games here in Philadelphia.
Back to the Giants.
I'm just kidding. That's true, though. But those arguments are a lot more intense in person. Trust me. No, but my point is that when you start losing personal interaction, it becomes easier to dehumanize the other side. It becomes easier for you to look at someone as an enemy and not as a person, a fellow citizen whom you disagree. And those are part of the dangers, I think, that are contributing to our the assaults on our democracy. That we really need to start paying attention to. How we get there, I'm not sure how exactly we do that, but conversation is the first place to start. You have to be able to have those conversations, or else it's a moot point.
So final question, a minute for both of you. You are all here, and by the way, a round of applause to all of you for coming. Thank you. It has been so reaffirming to speak to so many of you, and you excite me about the future because you're here as the most important role as citizens of the United States who care about the country. And so giving each of you a minute to conclude the role of citizenship, the role of these people here, those watching at home, and those who just want to change in big and small ways. Your message is what?
We are the leaders we've been looking for. To echo Ms. Ella Baker, we are the leaders we've been looking for. And I don't want to add a third element to the crossfire of right and left and middle. I want us to dismiss the ideological spectrum and think about what we care most about. What is our idea of justice without exception, and then to act on it. And I think if we get beyond the labels and get clear about our political commitments and what we mean by justice, then maybe we can build a better world. But we are the leaders we've been looking for.
Yes.
Top that one, Tara.
Let's see. Okay. No, it's not about topping. It's about complimenting, because we're up here together, and that's, I think, what everybody here in this room is about. You know, anytime I think about this, I think of what Martin Luther King said at a time where there was a lot of turmoil in this country and fighting for a fundamental right. And I think right now what we're going through is that we are fighting for our democracy at a crucial time. And he said that the measure of a man comes at not a time of convenience, but at a time of what they do in a time of challenge. There's obstacles. And I think that we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing in this time of challenge? Because it is the collective we that will make that difference. I firmly believe that there are more of us than there are of those who do not want to see our democracy flourish. And it starts with people like all of you in this room, going back to your communities, going back to your families, and being energized that we, the people, determine the future of this constitutional republic. The power of the Constitution rests with the people. It's what it says right there in that room by George Washington. And that is absolutely true. So in this moment, in this hour, where we are on the knife's edge, where do you choose to stand? It is ultimately up to us, because if we want this democracy to be, this government to be of the people, for the people, by the people, so it does not perish from the earth, then it starts with every single one of us doing our part as responsible, engaged, informed, dedicated citizens of this country.
Tara Setmayer, Dr. Eddie Glaude, to all of you, thank you. More to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Stay where you're at. More to come. Thank you all.